Hi, my name is Dr. Dana Wasserman, and welcome to Tough Talk with Dr. Dana. Today, we're going to be talking about grief and meaning in the age of COVID-19. But first, what I want you to do is to look at the disclaimer below, read that clearly because it's really important. Next, I need to read you the other disclaimer. It's also really important. I'm legally required to tell you that I'm not providing psychological services and that this isn't intended to treat, diagnose, or cure any psychological issues you may have. I will be sure to honor your questions so that if necessary, you will better know when to seek help. Thanks for that. So I'm going to tell you about this day I had last week. It was a Thursday, and it was fantastically stupendously awful. I woke up in the darkest, blackest, grumpiest mood, and I couldn't necessarily understand why. Now, to be fair, I had to rule out any kind of mood changes because I live with bipolar 2 disorder. I find that in retrospect that this wasn't necessarily related to my bipolar 2 disorder. Rather, it was just a single day. I warned my husband, I warned my kids that mom is just a big old grump and to stay back. It was as if somebody had taken black gauze and wrapped it around my head. I think you get the picture. So I woke up the next day and the mood had dissipated. It was gone. And I found that I was really quite fascinated by that day, as if what happened to me that day? I haven't had a day that dark in a while. And then suddenly I thought about this brilliant short article by the therapist Lori Gottlieb, and it was for the New York Times. And she's also a columnist for The Atlantic magazine. I highly, highly recommend it. And she wrote an article called Grieving in the Face or Grieving in the Time of Coronavirus. And it was just beautiful and short and to the point. And it occurred to me that that day I was grieving. I was grieving losses due to COVID-19. So I thought today that we would go through some of those losses. How do we cope with some of those losses and grief? And then how do we make sense of them? How do we make meaning out of them so that we can heal and move forward? So let's start with a few definitions. I think that's really important here because I think there are a few terms that are really easy to get mixed up. First, grief is the internal response to loss, that is our thoughts and our feelings. Mourning is the external manifestation of those thoughts and feelings, how you emote about them, how you express yourself about them. Bereavement is simply the period of time in which you are grieving and mourning. So I thought I wanted to get those straight. And this quarantine has changed the ways we normally grieve, both individually and collectively, and how one copes will influence the way one moves through grief, regains a sense of control, and finds meaning and ultimately acceptance. Let's talk about losses. So, Lori Gottlieb talked about, sort of the bigger, more profound losses versus the smaller ones. And I think it's important that we differentiate them, even though qualitatively they might feel very similar. So I'm not necessarily valuing one against the other. I should also make a quick disclaimer. If you see any smoke, I have lit incense during this, and it's nothing else. Just wanted you to know. So bigger losses during COVID-19. Well, God forbid you have a loss of a loved one. You lose your health because you get sick during COVID-19. The loss of a job, the loss of your income. But there's also the loss of rituals and funerals and communities gathering to grieve in whatever special mode they have. There's the destabilization of our children's education. I mean, I see my kids move from just going to school every day to this homeschooling, and it's a major shakeup in their lives. And there is in fact loss involved. There's a loss that the belief that we can fully protect our loved ones. Well, I always like to think that I can protect my older parents from illness and misfortune. But for the first time, I really feel like, as they're thousands of miles away, I can't do anything. And they're sure as heck not moving up here anytime soon. The loss of predictability, just the things we take for granted, fully stocked market shelves, even just walking outside, whether or not you wear a mask and wondering, am I going to be okay? And perhaps most importantly, we grieve the loss of a sense of certainty and control. We don't know what's happening with COVID-19 each day, and each day brings us new information. And that not knowing can be very unsettling. But let's not discount smaller losses. For example, for younger folks, they miss prom, graduation, band concerts, sports activities. These are all very important milestones in a young person's life, not to mention people who've had to postpone weddings and just basic separation from family and friends. So, as you see, there are a lot of losses that people do endure, and people do have their own individual responses to those losses. So, let's talk about that, okay? People process and express their grief in their own individual ways. And we see grief, we typically see this manifest as sadness, pain, it could be anger, anxiety, discomfort, because grief is complex and multi-layered and it is difficult, but it is also natural and it is also useful because we're all going to experience loss in our lives somehow. So it's important that we learn how to cope with it and move through it. Grief is about turning inward to introspect in order to think, the world has changed and I need to adapt. I need to make changes because the world has changed. And it's okay to feel grief over what we're losing and not to minimize those things we might consider a small loss, maybe that weekly card game or what have you. It's okay to feel grief and sadness over that because it's something that we've become accustomed to, we've enjoyed, we've gotten used to, and don't minimize. When we allow ourselves to feel grief, it allows us to let grief do its job so we can then move toward a sense of freedom. Okay. So what do we do about grief now that we've talked about it? Well, we name it and we claim it. I love that. First, we should acknowledge the grief, ideally. That is, and this is hard to do, that we sit with the discomfort of pain and sadness, and you sit with it. That's hard to do because we're going to more likely do things to defend against that. Let me give you an example. That day that I was in a really, really dark mood, I couldn't sit still. I cleaned everything 3 or 4 times. I was just running around like a whirling dervish. I was defending against sitting with maybe the pain of loss and discomfort that I was having because of the situation with COVID-19. I would definitely try to encourage our children to talk about their feelings of loss as well. And let me give you an example. My daughter turned 13 during this quarantine, and for whatever huge festivities that we had planned for her were a no-go. And boy, she was bummed. She put on a brave face, but she was bummed. I wasn't perfect in what I said to her. I hope my sentiments were felt, which were the following. This must feel really terrible. I'm really sorry that you had to spend your 13th birthday this way. I hope that, in time we'll be able to do a proper celebration for you. She seemed to be okay with that, but, she of course blew me off because she's 13 years old. So I'll give her that. And it's important to try not to hold in or internalize these difficult feelings because if they're not expressed, I promise you, they will become manifest in some way. They will come out, typically not in a very healthy way. The next thing to do with grief is to try to stay in the present. That is, this happens by deeply feeling our loss and doing things to feel safe within ourselves by utilizing the means of comfort for our senses. So we're feeling really bad, but you don't have to sit there and feel really bad. You can use music, dancing, art, lighting incense. I love, wonderful, soft, sweet smells. That calms me and helps me feel better. And grieving and promoting a sense of calm, they don't have to be mutually exclusive. They can happen together. In fact, I think they need to happen together in order to move through grief. So when grieving, we begin to ponder the fragility of life. That's kind of a beautiful thing if you think about it. Like, wow, life is really special. What do I need to do to even make my life even more special? I want to talk about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and some of you may have heard of her. She was the preeminent researcher on grief back in the 20th century, and she came up with 5 stages that, at the time, it was believed to be linear to move through grief, and it was denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. That you move through that, you get to acceptance, and you're done. Well, a few things. First of all, they found that no, people don't move linearly through grief. In fact, if anything, people tend to jump around. And a lot of times during what we call an anniversary reaction, that there's an anniversary to something that's been really upsetting, we'll feel and sort of go back to feeling a certain way. Maybe you'll feel angry on a certain day. And that it doesn't just simply move from denial to acceptance. Now, in addition, that through further research on grief, that they've added a 6th stage, and that is finding meaning. And finding meaning helps to promote sustenance in these really difficult times. And they can be achieved by fully experiencing the depth and stages of one's grief. That you got to get in there and really feel it and really express yourself. And meaning heals, allowing for grief to transform and provide valuable meaning. This is a time for reflection. So it's important that you make yourself space to prioritize what is meaningful. We can do this by figuring out what matters most to you. And this wouldn't be the worst time to make a list of your priorities. What does matter most to you? And we can talk about our feelings. And this can lead to understanding and an examination of them. And ultimately to come to terms with them, and then leading to acceptance. So we still have all these feelings. We are still coping. What can help with this process of making meaning? Well, keep a journal, and keep a journal to put words to our losses and to identify ways to move forward. I can't emphasize that enough, that when we put our feelings and words into language, it inherently orders them and helps us make sense of our inherently chaotic emotional world. And then I want you to think about other difficult times you have been through and write about how you've healed and how you've recovered. And that reminds you that you do have strength and that you do have the means to get through whatever grief you're going through in the meantime. So I want to take a look and see what time we have here. Oh, it's 2:15. So I was going to go on to talk about anticipatory grief, but that'll take us all the way to 2:30. And so why don't I take a look at and see if we have any questions about grief. Let's see. Okay. Well, I don't necessarily have any questions so far. So why don't I talk about anticipatory grief, which is related to, but not exactly the kind of more ambiguous grief that we just talked about. Okay, so anticipatory grief, okay, is a sense of fearful anticipation. It's a mourning process when we sense that a loss is about to happen, but we don't know exactly what it is yet. And hold on only 1 second here. Little technical difficulty for you right in front of a really important moment. There you go. Okay, so anticipatory grief, a mourning process when we sense that a loss is going to happen, but we don't know exactly what it is yet. Then there are signs of anticipatory grief. Okay, there are a bunch of signs, and I think I felt like I identified with a bunch of these. And social yoga, I will definitely get to your question in 1 minute. You feel on edge. There's a sense of dread, as though something bad is just around the corner, but it's unclear what it might be. In other words, you're just waiting for the other shoe to drop. You feel a persistent anxiety and overwhelm, and you feel angry at the things that you can't control. You constantly jump to the worst case scenario, and you find yourself withdrawing or avoidant of others. You're exhausted and you're simply wiped out all the time. And so I'm going through this quickly because I see some questions coming in. How to cope with anticipatory grief, that feeling that you're about to lose something, but you haven't lost it yet and you don't know what it is. You want to validate and affirm your feelings, that what you're feeling is okay and understandable. And physiologically, to stay fed, hydrated, rested, and connected to friends and loved ones. Make sure you have adequate rest and relaxation through this. And most importantly, I think you have to find the means to express yourself. Creative outlets are especially helpful right now. Journaling, dancing, collaging, making music, etc. There you go. All right, so here we go. How do you grieve a relationship or a person who is still alive? Oh, that's such a good question because it happens, I think, all the time. I think the best and, of course, the hardest way to do that is to really sit with the painful feelings of an end to something, whether it's a breakup of a romantic partnership or whether it's the end of a friendship, that you need to sit with that pain and sit with that, awful feeling of the losses that you have endured, because, maybe no matter how bad a particular relationship was, for some people, there were definitely positive things there that they loved. And you need to sit with that and then make sure at the same time, like I discussed, make sure you're taking care of yourself through that grieving process. But absolutely, they can still happen while someone's alive. Is holding on to grief for too long unhealthy? Is it important to move on? Is holding on to grief for too long unhealthy? Is it important to move on? Boy, this is a huge topic within the field of psychology. Boy, this is a graduate school lecture unto itself. I want to say that, in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, there's, under bereavement, they give a specific amount of time which someone should ideally, grieve. But honestly, I think if one ceases to begin functioning in a normal for that person's way, again, it's probably too long. That if the grief and the hurt and the pain are preventing that person from living his or her life in a productive way, then I think that's too long, and that something needs to be done to help, open up. Maybe there's a part of that pain that hasn't been examined yet, that's sitting there and festering, but it is rendered unconscious for whatever particular reason. So that's something ideal for, either a good friend or therapy to help with. Do you agree that it takes about 6 months to come to a good place after a loved one passes? Let me read that again. Do you agree that it takes about 6 months to come to a good place after a loved one passes? Oh, boy, that's tough because it really, I think, it banks on the nature of the relationship. I'd like to say on average, yeah, that sounds about right. It sounds about right to me. That 6 months, give or take, yeah, I can see that. That's enough time to work through pain, sit with the pain, sit with the grief, do what you do to take care of yourself. Is it okay to never get over it? I think so. I think it's about acceptance rather than getting over it. Absolutely, absolutely. And when I do work with people as a psychologist with the grief, I'm very, very cognizant of using that term, getting over it, because I don't think people get over loss necessarily. You get through it. And sometimes you move back a little bit, you regress a little bit to an emotion that's unpleasant, and then you move forward again. So I'm glad you mentioned that particular phrase. Okay. How to cope with the loss of family due to changes of your own faith? Wow, what a fantastic question. How to cope with the loss of family due to changes of your own faith? Well, again, what do we have here? We have a loss, and I don't know exactly what the nature of the loss, whether it was a friendly a friendly break, or was it one that had more animosity to it. But I think it's a loss like any other, in a sense, in that there are relationships that have ended, and there are aspects of those relationships that were once loved and valuable and appreciated, and that are gone now. And so I think I would treat yourself gently in that, and I would make sure that you have someone, a good friend, or you have people in your lives that you're socially connected to talk to about these losses, because they're real. And I certainly don't underestimate them in any sense of the word. So, all right. Anything else? Well, I think we're good here. All right. All right. Well, thank you very much for spending time with me today. My name is Dr. Dana Wasserman, and this has been Tough Talk with Dr. Dana. Take care. Bye-bye.